Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Access Blockbusters Pod, and we are continuing right along with our DCEU rewatch. So, in today's episode, we are going to be talking about the 2018 film, the first and only film in the DCEU to make $1 billion, Aquaman. Thank you guys so much for joining us again on the Access Blockbusters Pod. If you are enjoying this DCEU rewatch series, or if you're enjoying any of the content on the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel, make sure to subscribe. Give this video a like if you are indeed watching on YouTube. The podcast is available in two formats. One being on YouTube, where the whole audio clip as well as some pictures in the background are available on YouTube. So if you're on YouTube, make sure to give the video a like. Comment down below with what you think about Aquaman and what the last time you have seen the film and what your last experience was. But also, the podcast is available on Spotify as well. So make sure to check it out there and give the show a rating if you would be so kind to do so. Thank you guys again so much for joining us, and let's jump right into this episode about Aquaman. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the format of these episodes, where I go back and rewatch a film, usually in a franchise. So we're going through the DCEU right now. If you want to check out any of the previous episodes, we've done Man of Steel, we did Batman v Superman, Suicide Squad, Wonder Woman, Justice League, and now we're doing Aquaman. The way that these podcast episodes will go is I will take the first part of the video or the podcast to talk about just the general context surrounding each of these movies or shows. So what was going on at the time, especially in the particular franchise with the DCEU, and then talk about my first experience with the film and how my expectations were going into this rewatch. And then the second thing we'll do is the biggest chunk of this podcast, where we'll go basically doing a breakdown of sort of a play-by-play of the film. I always take extensive notes when I'm doing these podcast episodes and when I'm watching these movies, and so we have a lot to get into, just basically what I was thinking throughout the film, or some of the things that stood out to me, some of the things that I didn't like this time, some of the things I did like this time. And then the last little bit of the podcast will be me just kind of giving my updated thoughts, conclusions, and how my thoughts and opinions may have changed from the last time I saw the film. So that is the general structure of this podcast. And again, if you haven't subscribed to the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel, I would encourage you to do so for more of this kind of content. Okay, without further ado, let's get into Aquaman. So, yeah. Basically, every single podcast episode that I've been doing about this DCE rewatch, we've been kind of doing a little bit of a play-by-play on the state of the DCEU heading into Aquaman, or heading into that particular project. So now we're going to talk about the state of play heading into Aquaman. Like I said in previous episodes, DC has had, up until this point, it's had a little bit of a bumpy ride, right? Because we had Man of Steel, which was, well, I wouldn't say the word divisive. It wasn't universally beloved. And so that was sort of the kickstarting point to the DCEU. Came out in 2013, and then the next project came out in 2016 with Batman v Superman, which was a follow-up to Man of Steel. But as I talked about in my rewatch podcast of Batman v Superman, that was really less of a Man of Steel 2 as it was more just a Batman film where he's fighting Superman. Because I think that Batman was really fleshed out a lot better in that film than Superman was. I digress, though. You can go check out those videos later on. But anyways, yeah, so we were off to a little bit of a bumpy ride with Man of Steel, but, we had foundations. And then Batman v Superman came out and certainly didn't help the narrative because it was also a little bit of a bumpy ride. In fact, getting a much lower critical score and not making, nearly enough of its box office potential, because it was a $1 billion film in the making, and it couldn't capitalize on that. Suicide Squad didn't help things. It made a ton of money, something in the $800 million or $700 million range, but it was critically panned. And then you had your big first win with Wonder Woman, which made a decent bit of money, I think $700 or $800 million. So really good for Wonder Woman, and more importantly, was really critically successful. But then we had Justice League, which was a disaster just in terms of production, right? Everything that went on with the production of Zack Snyder having to leave, and then Joss Whedon coming in, but then things came out afterwards that said Joss Whedon was sort of a negative force on the set. And that's, again, not me making any sort of, inserting my own personal opinions about the whole situation or anything like that. Just sort of sharing what has been reported thus far. A lot of conflict with the actors, including Ray Fisher and reportedly Gal Gadot. And so that film came out, and it was kind of just a sort of a stain on the reputation of the DCEU. That being said, though, they had announced a lot of different projects, and a lot of these projects had been going into development anyways, and so we got our Aquaman film, which, to be fair, it came out a year later than Justice League. So it wasn't like it came out immediately following the Justice League film's release. Which, by the way, you can go check out my more detailed thoughts. But I'm one of those people who don't hate the theatrical cut perhaps as much as other people do. But again, go check out the podcast episode where I talk about Justice League in a separate video/podcast. So we were heading into Aquaman, and look, Jason Momoa as Aquaman was not my favorite part of Justice League, but neither was he my least favorite part. I think that he was mostly playing Jason Momoa, especially towards the end of the film where, you got to see him kind of be Jason Momoa, for lack of a better term. And it seemed like this Aquaman was really hinging on that as his personality. So I was really curious to see him as the lead heading into the first time I saw Aquaman, because I was wondering, could he lead a film? If you're leading a film, right? Even, I think the most comedy of comedies, unless it's sort of a spoof kind of thing like a Monty Python, for example. But even comedies have their dramatic moments, right? And the leads are there to carry those moments through fruition, right? Jason Momoa, I think, has proven to be charismatic. I think even comedic at times. But up until this point, I was curious to see, could he carry the drama of being the leading person in a solo film. So that was definitely one thing that I was looking for. Also, all the underwater stuff, because, again, up until this point, we hadn't gotten our Avatar 2s, we hadn't gotten our Black Panther Wakanda Forevers. So I was really curious to see how we would develop Atlantis and sort of talk about all the different things that were going on there. Also, though, you had a stacked cast, right? You had... just going to list off a few. Tamara Morrison, who you may know from Boba Fett fame and all the Clone Troopers. He was there as Thomas Curry, Arthur's father. Nicole Kidman was a huge get for the DCEU. She was there as Atlanta, Arthur's mother. You had Amber Heard. And before we get any further, I want to say that I am not going to be discussing in this video any of the external things that were going on. I think mostly after the release of this first Aquaman film, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm not here. This is not the channel, certainly not the channel where we talk about things like that. I acknowledge that there was a lot of drama that went on with Amber Heard post Aquaman, and I think it'll be a little bit more pertinent when we get to Aquaman: The Lost Kingdom, the last film in this DCEU rewatch. And so we won't get there for a little bit, but I'll at least talk about it in the same sort of vague terms that I do now when we get to Aquaman 2, but perhaps it's more pertinent for that film because a lot of the stuff that had gone on came out after this film. So I definitely won't be addressing it here, only to say that, afterwards I acknowledge that there was a lot of drama. There are court cases. You can check out copious other websites and copious other YouTube channels if that is what you desire to learn about. But this is not the channel for that. We're really strictly here to talk about Aquaman and the film. So when I talk about Mira, when I talk about Amber Heard, it's purely as a performer, purely as her playing this character of Mira and how I thought about her in this film. Just wanted to make that clear. Anyways, we also had Dolph Lundgren, which was, I think it's a tremendous get. Patrick Wilson playing Orm. You had Willem Dafoe, who is just a veteran of these kind of franchise movies, as well as just being a tremendous actor in his own right. And Julie Andrews even makes an appearance as the Karathan. I could be mispronouncing that. You totally forgot that she was in this movie. I did, at least. And when she popped up again, I was like, oh, that's Julie Andrews' voice. So, yeah, something to keep note of. But, yeah, I mean, it was an all-star cast. Also, Abdul Mateen the second. Yahya, I'll just call him Yahya if that's okay with you guys. I don't want to butcher his name every single time. But, yeah, he was in the film as well, playing Black Manta. So, a lot of really amazing performers in this movie. And the first trailers came out, and it looked visually exciting. It looked like it was taking that narrative of Aquaman was always the lamest member of the Justice League. The guy talks to fish and wears bright colors and whatever. And it looked like it was really embracing that Jason Momoa charisma, and also quote-unquote coolness, I suppose, and making it a key integral part of Aquaman's personality. So that was something that I was definitely interested to see. Obviously, you got hints of that in Justice League, where he was kind of doing the same thing there. So yeah, I watched Aquaman 2018, and I was entertained for the most part. Certainly was not, my favorite movie of the year. It certainly wasn't, one of the best comic book movies I had ever seen, but I was definitely entertained by the film the first time I had seen it. And so it was definitely another feather, I think, in my opinion, at least in the DCEU's cap. However, I think more importantly, and I think more pertinent to DC than my own personal feelings about the film is that, yes, I mean, Aquaman didn't have the highest critical rating either. I think to this day, perhaps, no, there's two of them. So I think in terms of the films, the two films that really had critical success were, I take that back, I think three. One being Wonder Woman, the other being The Suicide Squad, directed by James Gunn. And then I think Shazam, the first Shazam film, did pretty well for itself. As well. But anyways, yeah, I mean, Aquaman was not, it wasn't the most well received film in the DCE, which is fine. It doesn't have to be. But I think much more importantly was another narrative point of success because Aquaman became the first billion-dollar film in the DCEU. Now, at the time, we didn't know it would be the only billion-dollar film in the DCEU. And in fact, I believe that none of the rest of the films that came after even came close. A lot of that, having to do with the pandemic and the actor strikes and things like that. And so that was definitely a factor. But yeah, none of the films afterwards came even close. Shazam, Birds of Prey, obviously the Wonder Woman 1984 came out in streaming. The Suicide Squad came out during the pandemic. And then you had those four films, Flash and Blue Beetle, Shazam 2, and Aquaman 2. So yeah, nothing even remotely came close. But it was a big deal, right? It seemed like despite the sort of lackluster reception of Justice League, you had two films surrounding it, Wonder Woman being critically beloved and Aquaman being financially successful. And so there was still hope, I think, in the DC brand, and we continued to move forward with other films like Shazam. And it certainly wasn't about the quality and the money at this point. I think there were a lot of things that were going on in the company that really caused it to splinter. But, that's not really neither here nor there. We're just here to talk about Aquaman, so we will talk about Aquaman. So that was what I was expecting going into this rewatch of Aquaman. I was expecting to be entertained and didn't really remember a whole lot more. I think for a lot of these DCEU films, it had basically been since the first time I saw the film that I was rewatching it, and this was another one of those films that was the case. So was definitely super interested to see what I would think this time around. That's a big reason why I do these videos and do these podcasts. It's I think a lot of you guys find them very entertaining because it's a chance for you guys to not have to, if you don't want to see the film again, just kind of go through the film through someone else and hear someone else's opinion about it, which I think is fun. But for me personally, it's a chance to revisit these films in a very fresh light, not sort of clouded by all of the things that were going on at the time, which is why I give the context, by the way, at the beginning, because I think it's important to kind of color what a lot of our expectations were going into the film, what a lot of the reception was coming out of it, et cetera, et cetera. So just a little bit of disclaimer there. So let's get into Aquaman itself. The opening title sequence is I like to comment on these because it's always the first thing that I see with these DC films, and it's just fun to kind of get myself going in terms of taking notes. But yeah, I mean, the opening sequence utilizes that water theme, which I think is very fun. It's pretty stylized as well, which I think is immediately apparent. But again, if you've been watching these podcast episodes about the DCEU, you'll know that I've begun to pick up on the fact that they love narration in these movies. I can't explain why. Batman v Superman standing out to me, Viola Davis and Suicide Squad standing out, even Wonder Woman having narration, and this is no exception. This film starts out with Arthur Curry basically giving the most narration of narrations that you can give. He's like, my mother was this, and my father was this, and they weren't meant to be together, but who knows what would happen. And so we move forward from there. Honestly, I've just kind of drowned it out at this point, no pun intended. It's just sort of a part of these films, and I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever. It's a quick and perhaps a little bit lazy but easy way to kind of get into the film. We quickly meet Tamara Morrison playing a young Thomas Curry, and then Nicole Kidman playing a young Atlanta. Quote unquote young. I don't actually know how Atlanteans age. But anyways, yeah, that's the whole other side. It's a classic story trope, right? You have this mysterious figure washing up or kind of, being found and discovered and not really being familiar with Earth. And then they fall in love with a human. And then, they have a child who is half this and half that. It's sort of the Percy Jackson kind of vibes or whatever. But a lot of other films do this as well. It's just a classic trope for films, and it's nothing new here. But yeah, I mean, Nicole Kidman and, being an A-lister, and then Boba Fett, Tamara Morrison, it's pretty cool. It's I think, pretty good casting. They're both pretty good actors, and so, it's nothing to complain about. We kind of fast forward through their love story. We see that through another, not a montage, but just kind of flash forwarding through with Arthur's narration. Again, classic story tropes. I think you're going to start to pick up on some themes that I was picking up on as we go along here. There's a lot of tropes that are used in this film, a lot of shorthands in films that have been used over and over and over again, which I don't always think is a bad thing, and we'll talk about that as we get along in this podcast episode. But it's something worth pointing out. It's just that this film utilizes a lot of different tropes as it moves along. Anyways, there's also I wrote this down because I thought this was interesting. There are a couple scenes where it's Nicole Kidman being sort of and again, I hate to use this cliche term, especially in this context, but I'm going to, a fish out of water, because she's unfamiliar with Earth, which I guess makes sense. She washes up ashore. But there are some really goofy scenes at the beginning where she's eating fish out of Thomas Curry's fish tank, which I'm like, okay, I guess so. It feels a little bit weird. I don't know. I didn't know if I bought all of that, especially when you find out that she can totally talk and she's totally just a normal person. But at the beginning, it almost makes it look like she has no idea. It's almost like an ET kind of situation where it's like, how do we communicate and all that kind of stuff. But then she's just a totally normal person. So I think that kind of took the wind out of those sails. But yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason that you buy this is also obviously Nicole Kidman, who is having to play sort of the confused, I don't know where I am kind of person in this scenario. But then Tamora Morrison, his chemistry and his charisma is actually quite strong here as well. He plays just sort of the everyman lighthouse keeper, but I think it really works because he's just a charming, kind of quiet guy. And I think that, I think that works well, especially in this case where you're supposed to have part of the film, part of the message of the film is about these two different worlds colliding in this one person of Arthur Curry. So yeah, I thought that was cool. You get to hear also, then you get to see Atlanta. She's pregnant now with Arthur, and he's kind of named after a hurricane, but then also King Arthur, which I think is kind of interesting. And yeah, I mean, some of the dialogue at the beginning is also just super on the nose. I think at one point Atlanta is, talking to Thomas Curry, and she's like, "Oh, Arthur can unite our two worlds." And I'm like, okay, yeah, I guess so. And then we're on our way. So the film is kind of taking for granted that the audience is just on with them for this ride, because some of the again, tropes and cliches and dialogue, it's not particularly clever or subtle or nuanced or anything like that, but I think it works to just really quickly set up what they want to set up. And in that regard, I'm there for that, right? Like if the film knows what it wants to be, and the actors are charismatic enough and they're performing well enough that you're not noticing, how poor the dialogue is in certain places or things like that, I'm okay with it. It's not, I wouldn't prefer an entire film that's just terrible dialogue. And this film is not all terrible dialogue, thankfully. Neither is it all cliches, although it uses cliches at pivotal points to kind of get where it needs to go. But I mean, I think that when a filmmaker kind of understands what he or she, or they want to make, I think that you kind of have to get on board at a certain point, or you don't. And I think James Wan is very clear and explicit with what he's doing at the beginning. It's just a very traditional, stereotypical, is that the right word? Archetypal kind of film that utilizes a lot of different storylines that have been used before. Anyways, basically they're having a conversation. Arthur is born now. He's a young kid. And then they get interrupted with a random explosion. And I know that if you've seen the film or if you've seen videos commenting on the film, this is something that gets brought up over and over and over again. I only bring it up just to say it happens once, fine. It happens once here. It'll happen again. And we'll talk about what I think, why I think this is an underlying problem for the film, or at least what it says about the underlying writing about the film. And when we kind of get into the second and third and fourth random explosions that happen. I'm pretty sure I marked them all down. We'll see. I think there are 4, could be 3, but yeah, I don't know. Then we get these kind of sci-fi Atlantean suits, and I will admit that a suit guy is coming in. They're wearing these, I don't know how to, like glow stick Tron kind of suits. And I will say that at first it's a little bit jarring because everything in the film thus far, other than perhaps Queen Atlanta's costume, has been pretty normal. Just, normal film looking. But then we get these sci-fi kind of, I don't know how to describe them, almost like not Transformers, but I think you guys get the gist here. And they come into the scene and they're here to take Queen Atlanta back. And so, yeah, I mean, I was at first a little bit taken aback, but then I think the more that I looked at them, I was like, no, this is really cool. It's very stylized, and it kind of lends itself to the more sci-fi elements of this universe, which I think is pretty cool. Jason Momoa is still narrating, I think, at this point, and I didn't need more of that. However, one of the things that really stand out in the beginning, and again, we're only about 10 or so, 15 minutes into the film, is the action. The action immediately stands out about this film because unlike some of the other DCEU films or just comic book movies in general or action movies in general, James Wan is very clear and very upfront about the fact that he wants to make these action scenes as easy to see and as smooth as possible. Again, handheld action is a stylized choice, and sometimes it works very well. You have your Winter Soldiers, for example, that you have some hand-to-hand fights that are a little bit shakier, but I think that works to kind of make it feel more grounded. That's not what James Wan wants to do, and I actually appreciate that a ton here, because you have these really sweeping wide shots, right, that don't cut. I'm sure they cut, but, they kind of hide those cuts, right, where the camera is just zipping around one setting and following different characters, and so you have this action scene where Atlanta is fighting these soldiers, and it looks really great. Again, it does a lot here to mask some of the generic dialogue and some of the more over-dramatized elements here. But yeah, I mean, it's quite good, and it's really fun to look at. Even if nothing else is working, the action here really solid and different, and that's one of the things that I appreciate about it the most. So yeah, we get another scene here. So then Atlanta has to go. Because she's like, oh, they're gonna find me here, get another trope, but that's fine. And then speaking of tropes, we get another scene here where the kid Arthur is at the aquarium being bullied, and it's this sort of crazy dramatic sequence where all the fish in the fish tank are swimming behind him, which it looks I guess it looks cool if you're just looking at it sort of as a frame, but in the context of the story, it's kind of crazy that this just kind of happens and then nothing is made out of it later. Maybe it is, but we're just not, we don't have time to go through that. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, something that I wanted to point out here. Anyways, yeah, we get the title sequence here, and then we get Yahya Abdul-Mateen III, who is playing Black Manta. And yeah, I mean, we get this scene here where these pirates are boarding the submarine, and it's pretty violent. I mean, for PG-13, there's definitely some violence going on here. And we get Black Manta, we get his dad gives him a knife, and then Aquaman shows up here. The visuals, by the way, and we haven't even gotten to Atlantis yet, but the visuals so far underwater are very striking and very cool. And yeah, Aquaman does a classic superhero landing, which I think he will do at least 2 or 3 more times throughout the film. But this is the first, notable one. It is interesting to me. And I suppose this is just something where James Wan might have been like, get on board with it and don't question it, which I'm like, okay, I'm more than willing to do that if this is sort of one of the only nitpicks about the film. But in this opening action sequence on this submarine, he gets fired at by a bunch of guns. And I think he gets hit a bunch of times. He gets hit by Black Manta's father with this, I don't know, laser or explosive gun or something like that later. And I guess my question is, what exactly are Aquaman's powers? I don't think that's super well defined. In fact, I don't think anybody's powers, including Mera's, are super well defined in this film. I mean, we saw him in Justice League, and it seemed like he had some powers other than just being really buff and holding a trident in Justice League and, being able to fight Steppenwolf. But it's a little unclear how invulnerable he is and what that means for him as a character. I guess it doesn't matter that much, but it's something that I was thinking about as we went along these scenes, sorry. Anyways, yeah, so Aquaman is fighting these pirates, and he's coming off a little bit brutal, I will say. This is sort of a version of Aquaman that is sort of gruff and uncaring and a little bit different, I guess, sort of carrying on with the Justice League version of the character that was a little bit more gruff and didn't want to really, quote-unquote, play well with others, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, there's a scene even where like he goes through a bunch of smoke, and then it kind of, it zooms in on faces, and it's in slow motion, and it's very stylized. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's just, I think at the beginning here, you wanted to establish that this is not the silly Aquaman who is, running around and talking to fish, which is exactly what happens later on in the film. But I guess at that point, you're supposed to be on board with it. But rather, this is the cool Aquaman, right? This is the Aquaman that you want to hang out with and whatnot. So, yeah, I mean, just other than questioning, what his powers are, it's a pretty decent action sequence at the beginning. And then later on, he fights both Black Manta, I guess mostly Black Manta and his father later on. And he's really taking it to Black Manta. It's pretty brutal. And it makes you kind of think, right? Like, I guess later on in the film, Arthur admits to this and says he made a mistake here. And I think it's pretty clear he made a mistake here because he really just took it out on Black Manta. And you understand, why Manta would hate Arthur. Like, Arthur took... I get it that you're establishing Black Manta is not a great person. Neither is his dad. They're pirates and they were killing people at the beginning too. That's fine. That's not fine, I should say. It's fine, like in terms of the story. Establishing that, just to be clear. But you have, then you have Arthur again, sort of retaliating against Black Manta. So it doesn't make Arthur look like the best character. It also, you get why Black Manta, even though he's a bad person, would really hate Arthur. So it's this weird situation where you kind of don't like either of the characters, I guess. But yeah, I don't know. At this point, I was sort of saying to myself, so I see sort of the charisma of Jason Momoa in these scenes, and I get that he's sort of the big presence, right? He's a big presence, but is he a lead? Like we talked about at the beginning of this podcast episode. That's one of the big questions that I had is he really a lead at this point? And that question hadn't been answered for me. So we carry on. So then we really get into it here with Atlantis. So we finally get to see Atlantis, and we get to see King Orm, I believe. King Orm? Is it Orm or Orn? It's Orm, right? Anyways, I could be totally wrong about that. I'm going to pronounce it Orm the entire video, and if it's Orn, I think it's Orm. But anyways, correct me in the comments down below. Sorry about that. But yeah, we get to see Orm, and we get to see Patrick Wilson. And yeah, Patrick Wilson has a very specific job in this film. We'll talk about him, obviously, again in Aquaman 2, but he has a very specific job here, which is to basically be as Shakespearean villainy as he can, right? Like, I think that some of these films really have this desire to want to ham it up with their villains or have some of this, like, Shakespearean drama going on here. And, look, it doesn't make for the most complex of villains. No, which is a little bit of a bummer, actually, because he has a really interesting motivation, which kind of revolves around this medieval idea of kingdoms and sort of the fantasy elements of birthrights and thrones and things like that, almost a Game of Thrones kind of sense here. But he plays it all so dramatic and a little bit over the top that it makes it a little bit hard to take him seriously. But yeah, that's his one job, and I'm sure he was given that direction by James Wan. And so, yeah, I don't know. It was a little bit interesting for me. It didn't take me out of the movie at any point, but it also really didn't make me believe him as a character. Also, they got rid of those dumb talking bubbles that they had in Justice League, which I'm very glad about because those were quite annoying, I think. Even that it was only in one scene in Justice League, but I kind of thought if they had to do this every single time they wanted to talk to each other in Aquaman, it would have been really, really, really annoying. And also the idea that if you unite all the kingdoms and whatever, and you get to be called Ocean Master is just, it's such a dumb name, honestly. I get it that it's his name in the comics, but like, not every character has to just be called what they're called in the comics. It's sort of in line with this B movie kind of, tone that they're setting so far, where some of it is very serious, but then some of it is just over the top, and some of it is just kind of goofy. And this is definitely one of those, I will become the Ocean Master is definitely one of those scenes. So yeah, he's the king now. We learn that his father died, and then his mother returned and was banished to the trench, and now he is the king, and I guess he hasn't met Arthur yet. So yeah. Anyways, there's also, so this is the scene where he's with Volko, right? He's with Willem Dafoe, and he's talking to Dolph Lundgren, who is the king of one of the kingdoms. I forget its name. He's also Mira's dad, so she's Princess Mira, I suppose. And then he's basically trying to prove I can protect the kingdoms and I can unite them. And then there's another random explosion. So this is random explosion number 2, which is this submarine, which I think was super obvious at this point that it was a plant by King Orm. that he had basically sanctioned it to come here, and that he was going to look cool and be a protector and all that kind of stuff. Pretty obvious that was what was going on. But I suppose if you're the other characters in the film, that's not something that's on your mind if you're being attacked by a submarine. So yeah, I mean, just sort of, again, there are these deeper themes that they don't explore too much, that I wish they had explored a little bit more. Themes about the surface world versus the ocean, and pollution and trash and things like that. I mean, in a more complex film, you would have explored those themes in greater detail, but this is certainly not the film for that. So anyways, yeah, Volko, Willem Dafoe is there as well, and yeah, he's great as always. So yeah, anyways, there, after this scene, we get back to the surface world, and Arthur is hanging out with his dad, and then we get Mira, who looks very different from how she did in Justice League, but hey, different films, different directors, so whatever. And yeah, I think that you have Jason Momoa now playing this. I guess he's at the beginning of the film, now that I'm realizing, and we'll talk more about how he transitions into a different kind of character, I guess about a third through the film, and then another third through the film, he kind of transitions into another version of the character. But right now, he's still playing that aloofness, right? That aloofness that you saw when he killed Black Manta's father, and sort of that version of the character that was in Justice League as well. But I think it actually plays a little better off of Mira's kind of stubbornness. And, in comedy, right, if you're a duo, you have the goofball and sort of the straight man kind of performance, right, where it's like, the person not reacting to everything and not understanding. I think that Mira, if Mira being that person who's being stubborn and all that kind of stuff, and then Jason Momoa is trying to push against her, I think that works actually a lot better than just Jason Momoa being aloof and then just killing people, which is not a great look for the character, honestly. So I think that works a little bit better. Then we get the revelation that it was indeed a setup between Orm and Manta to kind of trigger this war between the surface world. Yaya is certainly hamming it up here. I know that there was a quote early on that not early on, but a couple years ago or maybe a year ago, that he was like, yeah, no, like I'm doing this other Aquaman film and this is all clown work and whatever. And people were like, okay, like, calm down. We know it's not Oscar-worthy work. And I will say that, you kind of understand, I suppose, why he would say something like that, because given his performance in this film, I mean, he's really hamming it up here. There's zero subtlety about his performance at all. Now, whether or not that was his conscious choice to be like, this is clown work for me, and so I'm just going to be as crazy as I can, or if it was James Wan directing him to do that, and then later on he's like, yeah, I mean, I was told to kind of act it up and whatever. I don't know, but I only have to judge what is on the screen, and what is on the screen is just a crazy over-the-top performance from Yahya Abdul-Mateen. But anyways, all that aside, then we go back to Arthur and Mira, and there's this huge tidal wave, and so they have to kind of save Arthur's dad, who, again, Mira is the one who saves him, and it's a question for me of, okay, so she has these powers of, I guess, being able to manipulate water or liquids in that way, and I'm not super versed in the comics, so if this is a power she has in the comics, okay, fine. I would have liked a little bit more of an explanation of why only she has superpowers out of everyone in the film, including Dolph Lundgren, including Willem Dafoe. Like, why is she the only one who has some kind of supernatural ability? I have no idea. I mean, is it a coincidence that the two leads are the only ones who have some kind of powers? No, obviously not. But yeah, and also she can breathe above water, I guess, which Willem Dafoe can, but some of the other people can. It's a little confusing to me. Maybe they explained this and I just totally missed it. But yeah. Also, there's this one line where Arthur says, "I didn't catch your name," and I paused and thought about that for a second. And I wasn't about to pause the movie and go and watch the Justice League scene again. I guess from my recollection, he doesn't say her name in that scene, which I guess so, but they were talking as if they were talking as if that they had known each other. And so that was confusing to me about how, like, maybe he recognized her in this moment, but in the Justice League scene, like, she was just somebody who was there that he had recognized, but wasn't super familiar with. And so that's why in Aquaman, he's like, oh, I know you, but, I don't know your name. The other confusing thing about this is that we establish later on that this is the first time that Arthur goes to Atlantis. And my question was, in the Justice League scene, what was that all about? Like, where was he? Was he just in some random location where there was a mother box and there were Atlanteans there who I just don't acknowledge the fact that he's not wanted in Atlantis? So these are all things that, don't affect this movie in particular, but when you're building a shared cinematic universe, especially when you do the synergy as well as you did from going from Batman v Superman to Wonder Woman, where I thought the synergy between those two films worked very well. The synergy between Justice League, which again was reshot and all these sorts of things, although the Mira scene was in Zack Snyder's cut of Justice League, so that was in the plan anyway. So there was a total lack of synergy between those two films, which again maybe just comes down to the fact that at a certain point James Wan was like, this is too complicated. I just want to write my movie. I don't want to work around all these things that were in Justice League, like the air bubbles, which is fine. Don't do the air bubbles. But other things about Arthur and Atlantis, I guess we just kind of wash over. So anyways, we get a news broadcast about the trash that had come up from the ocean that was from Earth, which I think, again, is a really interesting thing that does not get explored here. But we do get to see Randall Park playing Dr. Shin, I believe. It's always good to see Randall Park in these movies. One of the best parts about that Ant-Man film and WandaVision, I suppose. And yeah, I mean, just more of me kind of being a little bit confused about the timeline as well. Because you get these flashbacks here with Willem Dafoe and a young Arthur interspersed with the film, which I actually like. I think that the way that they intersperse the flashbacks between the present day is pretty well done. They explain it later on as Willem Dafoe sort of secretly training Arthur. Some of it's a little confusing, honestly, to where, like, how much does he know about Atlantis? How much does he want to go to Atlantis? It seems like he knows a bit about Atlantis, but then Willem Dafoe is intentionally hiding him from Orm, but Orm knows about him at a certain point. So I think some of these revelations could have been more impactful, but instead the movie just kind of tries to gloss over it. So yeah, I mean, these, in the grand scheme of this film, which does not take itself that seriously, I don't think it's a big deal. Just things worth pointing out as well. So we head back underwater, and these underwater scenes are beautiful. They're really great to look at. They are very CGI for sure, in comparison to something like an Avatar: The Way of Water, which is funny because those scenes were even more CGI, I'm sure. But the imagery really is quite beautiful to look at, and it's stylized. It's supposed to be stylized, and so this is going back to an earlier point I was making about how this film sort of distinguished itself in terms of the underwater stuff because it's more in the sci-fi realm, right? You have those guys in the suits, the soldiers coming to get Queen Atlanta early on, and it establishes that this is more of a sci-fi world, a sci-fi underwater realm. And so I think that just leaning into that, where you have water cannons and you have all this technology, is really cool. It's a really great way to distinguish Atlantis from, say, a Talokan, which is very much not a quote-unquote technologically driven society, or Avatar: The Way of Water, which is just sort of a different, universe, different world, and they're just underwater as well, which I think is, it feels more sci-fi, and I think that that's really a fun thing. Anyways, we meet Volko with Arthur and Mira, and they talk about this trident, which is sort of the big deus ex machina of the film. I mean, the trident in itself is not a weapon, I guess, but it's supposed to unite the kingdoms or whatever, and thus begins sort of the central plot of the film. So it's interesting, like, first film, Find the Lost Trident, second film, Lost Kingdom. It's fairly standard, I suppose. I do enjoy the mythology, though. We get some backstory and exposition here from Amber Heard and from Willem Dafoe. Those characters, they kind of talk about the mythology of Atlan, the first king, and then the trident, and what happened with all the, how Atlantis fell underwater. I think that that's really cool. I mean, it gives the film a little bit more of a mystical sense, just like how Wonder Woman did with the Themyscira, which I really liked. Anyways, this is the third random explosion that interrupts the conversation, and I guess this is where I want to touch upon this, because while these scenes in themselves are kind of funny and are not super consequential in the sense that it's not like they ruin my experience of the film, I did want to touch upon the fact that I think that this is an inherent tell that the writers are not super versed in subtlety, which I suppose is evident throughout the entire film. But I think that this is one key area where you do see that these are not writers who are either interested or skilled at subtlety, because the only way that they know how to transition between scenes, dramatic and action, are with explosions. And I'm not saying that doing it once isn't effective or even twice isn't effective, but they do it at least 4 times, I think, at this point. Yeah, because there's definitely one more and there could be a fifth one. And to me, that what that shows is just that these writers are not comfortable with writing transitions between scenes. And there are ways to do that. There are very simple ways to do that, I believe. But again, I'm not blaming the writers at all. I just think that this is something that kind of shows you what this kind of film is based on who was writing the film. So anyways, just something that I wanted to point out as well. Then Arthur gets captured and he meets with Orm. And like I said, while Patrick Willis is also hemming it up as the king and as the sort of rejected brother who wants the throne and all that kind of stuff, like I mentioned, I do think that there is something super interesting here about the sort of bastard children and the throne and who has the right to the throne and all that kind of stuff, bloodlines, whatever. It's not a huge part of the film ultimately, but I do think that it was something that they should have explored a little bit more. So yeah, there is that. Flashbacks are again coming in and out of the film, which again, I like these flashbacks between young Arthur and Volko. Dialogue, not the greatest. We just talked about the writers. There's a line. He's like, "Stop lying to me." It's, the very traditional, classic kind of line. The film is not shying away from its tropes. I will say that. So then, the shortcut to uniting the kingdoms, what is it? Well, it's obviously to challenge your opponent to gladiator combat. We love this in a comic book movie, of course. Your Thor Ragnaroks or your Black Panthers is probably Black Panther is the most analogous to this. You challenge your opponent. In fact, Black Panther came out earlier this year in 2018. But anyways, challenge them for the throne, all that kind of stuff. And we get the drumming octopus, which is, of course, the most iconic part of this entire movie, obviously. Again, though, what I will say and what I have said about other action scenes is I really enjoy this fight. It's really stylized, but the underwater movements are great. It's not stylized to the point where it's distracting, though. There are a lot of really wide shots so you can appreciate what's going on. I mean, obviously, there are scenes where like the whole crowd just starts cheering in unison. There's that scene which it's hamming it up, right? The movie has no interest in subtlety. But again, what I really enjoy about the film is that it's distinct in that regard, where it takes full advantage of its setting and uses the visual language around it. And again, it's all juxtaposed with things that I'm not appreciating as much, but I'm getting used to, right? I think there's a difference here where it's, there is some poor dialogue, again, interspersed between this fight. Like, for example, Volko is like, "This isn't a fight, it's an execution." And I'm like, yeah, of course it is. I mean, you didn't see that coming where, the older brother was so confident in his ability to kill Arthur, not the younger brother, to kill Arthur that he would have, called for this fight or whatever. Of course it's not a fair fight. But I think that the difference between this dialogue and other dialogue, other pieces of dialogue, is that the film is just not taking itself that seriously. And for what it's worth, the actors are charismatic enough that I'm like, it's fine. It's totally fine. Because again, if it's consistent with the film and if I'm enjoying what the film is giving me, then I don't think it's a bad thing inherently. So yeah, there's that. Arthur's trident is broken. And one thing I actually noticed, right? Because some of these films, or even TV shows, for example, don't have that kind of cinematic quality to them. But I really appreciated that there is just a distinctly cinematic quality to these fights and these scenes, which I really appreciate. So yeah, Aquaman escapes with Mira. And you know what? I think at this point in the film, I was really warming up to their chemistry. I think that, again, Jason Momoa is starting to unleash his more goofy, charismatic side, which I mentioned before, right? The first third of the film, he's playing this very aloof version of Aquaman. But now he's really transitioning into the more goofy side of the character, which I think is much more fun. And now you're playing off of Mira's stubbornness and sort of straight-nosed kind of character. And it works really well in that regard because there's a really nice back and forth kind of classic tension thing going on here. They go into the whale, very much Jonah inspired, or I guess in this film, Pinocchio inspired. And it works. Something about the movie, they use all these tropes, but it's definitely working. One thing that didn't work for me as well is the scene where they're emerging from the water, kind of slow motion Baywatch style, and there's a Pitbull song. I think it's Pitbull, could be wrong. That was a little bit too far for me. You had me for the most part with all these cheesy things, and then you do that, and that didn't really work for me. But anyways, we're in the Sahara Desert now, and they're on a plane. And yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of emotion here from Mira where she's talking about how she's homesick. And I thought, it's fine for the character. Like, I'm not super invested in Mira as a character. I'm more invested. I was gonna say I'm not invested in Arthur as a character either. I guess I'm invested in both of their journeys, although Mira's journey is not quite as defined in this film as I'd like it to be. But again, I'm more also invested in just them together, if that makes sense. Like I think there are a lot of couples in superhero and comic book movies that are just not well written. And while I'm not gonna say that this is the most well written romance in comic book movie history, I think that their chemistry works quite well together, I will say. Yeah, I mean, we have Jason Momoa just being fully Jason Momoa now and just jumping out of a plane after Mira, which is, it's fun. I think it's really fun. And the film is sort of turning into a classic adventure film, Indiana Jones style, which I think is cool. It doesn't feel super jarring because I think that you're transitioning well between these different elements of the film. It's just something where it's like, yeah, it's turning into a comedic adventure now, and you just kind of got to get on board because the film doesn't take itself seriously, and it's like, okay, yeah, I'm on board. So yeah, there is that. It really is a case of you just got to take the film for what it is, and if you don't want to, that's totally fine. You can understand why half the critics didn't like this film, but you can also understand why this film made as much money as it did. So yeah, speaking of over the top though, this scene I think did not need to be in the movie because you get a Tony Stark style montage where Black Manta is building his suit in the cave. Not in the cave, in some bunker somewhere, and there's another pop song in there, which, as you guys know if you've been watching my channel, I do not generally like pop songs in films. I think they're very distracting, and so this scene again, just too much, a little bit too much. You kind of reel it back here. Again, no pun intended. There's so many fish puns, so many water puns. Anyways, I'm not intending to make these, I promise. But yeah, I'm buying Jason Momoa's charisma. I'm buying Amber Heard's charisma, or sort of the what do you call it? The playing everything sort of straight and not buying anything that Jason Momoa's Aquaman is saying, which is fun. And then they're in this temple where they get the little bottle thing, and then they head off to Italy. So it's turning into that Indiana Jones style adventure quest. And we have a really cute montage here in Italy as well, where they're getting to know each other. It's not the most, it's a little rushed. The pacing is not super well done because obviously they've only spent a few days with each other, if that. But it's still, I think the film is just effective at conveying the kind of emotions that they're wanting you to feel with these two characters. So, yeah, I mean, it is kind of funny how quickly the movie changes tones here, because it was just an adventure quest, and it'll go back to an adventure quest later, but it turned into a romantic comedy, and it's going to turn into a big epic action finale later on. So I think it's just kind of funny. Yeah, and then we get a scene with Jaimon Hansu, who I totally forgot was in this film, but he plays one of the kings who is killed immediately, which is not as funny because we love Jaimon Hansu. He comes back in the DCEU later to play that wizard in Shazam, which is fun. And yeah, I mean, Orm again just clearly hamming it up here. And guess what? There's another random explosion. That's right. I think this is the last one. Because it's in Italy between a conversation between Arthur and Mira, and then there's this crazy explosion, and here comes Black Manta, and it leads to yet another really fun action sequence where they're kind of running across the rooftops of Italy, and I really enjoy it. I'm not going to keep saying the same thing over and over again because we're kind of accelerating now into the final brunt of this film. But again, really great action sequence, a lot of wide shots, a lot of really, camera following characters in a very smooth way. And I like it. Dialogue, again, is terrible in certain places, especially for Black Manta. I mean, the scene where he's like, "You can call me Black Manta," is just awful. I don't know who thought this was a good line or if anyone thought this was a good line, but anyways. And yeah, the fight, through the village is really fun. And then we get, we say goodbye to Black Manta for now until the post-credit scene. And then Aquaman and Mira are on a boat, and Mira kind of gives an inspirational speech about being part of two different worlds, just kind of laying out the theme of the film in as plain terms as you could possibly do. And you get it, right? Like you understand what's going on here. But yeah, I mean, what else can you say? Like I said, you kind of, at this point in the film, right? This is about 2/3, 3/4 through the film. You just got to be on board. If you're not on board, totally understandable. But I was on board here, and I was like, yeah, I mean, this is the theme of the film being told as explicitly as possible. But do I buy it? Sure. Why not? You get a scene here with Volko where he's imprisoned by Orm, and I mean, look, you get it, right? Like, I understand why Orm would be upset, because it really does seem like Volka was just training his usurper. So you understand why he's upset. It still doesn't make the fact that he's just really being, just over the top and hamming it up any less so. But I get it. You're always hinted at the potential of a film like this, though, where he's talking about the bloodlines and stuff like that. But then we transition to actually one of my favorite scenes in the film, because it's showing James Wan, who is classically a horror director, really be at his best here, because the scene where the trench monsters attack the boat is legitimately frightening. The way that the scene is shot, so it's going from, romance to adventure to now horror, and these creatures, they're terrifying when they're in the shadows. And it looks like it's shot completely differently. It's legitimately kind of scary. And I guess, I shouldn't have been surprised. Like, it's James Wan. I guess I was surprised because the entire rest of the film was so stylized and so kind of smooth, right? But this scene here is just crazy how well done it is with all the horror elements with the monsters. And the shot where all the creatures, so they dive into the water off the boat and all the creatures are following them down, is really one of the great scenes in this film, I think. And it's really beautiful. It's sort of meant to be one of those cinematic shots, and I think it's really cool. They end up going back to, I guess, this is what I wanted to talk about, because so Arthur and Mira are going down into the trench, and all these monsters are following them. And then there's a lot of weird visual noise where they're getting sucked into some kind of portal or whirlwind or whirlpool or whatever. And guess where they end up? They end up at the Earth's core, which it's really pushing it sometimes, right? With this film, like, okay, they're at the Earth's core now. This isn't Kong versus Godzilla, right? It's Aquaman, which I suppose, but the thing that those two films have in common is that they just don't take themselves seriously, which I guess is fine. And Nicole Kidman's back. I remember at the time in 2018 that I saw that coming completely. I was like, yeah, I mean, it's obvious that, you keep hinting at her death and her exile. But, it's so, I thought it was so apparent that she would come back. I think just because they kept talking about it, right? And you never really saw her death. But yeah, I mean, when she showed up again, I wasn't surprised at all. I was like, yeah, it makes sense for the film. She's wearing this really funny fish costume, which I'm sure was either fun for her or embarrassing for her to do. But anyways, yeah, she's back, and then we're at the Earth's core, and I did actually, because there are a lot of emotional beats in this film that it's trying to get you to feel things, but most of them are sort of over dramatized and a little bit overdone. I think the line, though, where Arthur tells his mom that every single day his dad goes to the dock to look for her, I think actually was really sweet and kind of sad. And I'm really glad that they paid that off later on in the film. So anyways, now Arthur has to go find this trident. This is the end of the quest, and he's confronted by this monster called the Karathan, Julie Andrews. And I will say, though, that this final scene or sequence here before the finale is very cool. It's well shot because it's murky in the water, but you have a sense, you get to see everything super clearly. And I really like how the ability to talk to the sea creatures is what distinguishes him from other characters. Now, why he specifically was given that ability, I have no idea. But I do think that comes into play really nicely later on. But it is something that I think was really helpful in distinguishing why is Arthur able to unite the kingdoms in that way. I thought that was really good. So, anyways, then we get this final giant battle where you're distinguishing the armies because one is reddish and one is bluish, and I guess it's helpful at least for the viewer, and it's a ton of CGI for sure, like tons of ocean creatures. But again, I've said this all podcast, it is not boring to look at. In fact, it's quite interesting to look at. And so while it's very clearly all CGI-ish, definitely not boring to look at all. And I think what's interesting about this movie is that tonally it's going for that sort of 80s vibe. It's very cheesy, it's very corny, it's very over the top, and it's not taking itself seriously. But it's also only a film that could really be made in 2018 or later with all the technology that was used to make this film, which I think it's fun. I think more films like that. Later on, we got a Top Gun Maverick in a few years, which I think was less cheesy, or just more in the style of the 80s, but you know what I mean. Where like films that just don't take themselves too seriously. I think it's a good thing to have these once in a while, because a lot of comic book films take themselves way too seriously, and it can work. Like I think The Batman with Robert Pattinson took itself very seriously and was very good, versus something like a Batman v Superman, which I think was maybe less good. So yeah, I think that there is a place for these kinds of films to exist. I do wonder though, how long it took to animate this entire sequence, but anyways, yeah. So then Arthur shows up with his own army of sea creatures, and it's very on the nose for Volko to say the king has risen. Very Jesus Christ metaphors, which I guess. But anyways, yeah, and talking to the fish comes in handy because Arthur uses those the sea creatures, master of the ocean. I guess he's the ocean master. I just got that. Anyways, to defeat the armies, and yeah, I mean now you get this giant sea battle, and it's just to kind of complete the arc of the B movie. You have the two leads kiss in the middle of the fight, which is crazy to think about, but again, you're on board or you're not. And then you have sort of a final fight on top of this ship thing, I think, between Orm and Arthur. And I think, what's interesting is that when you're watching this fight, I mean, despite everything that I've said about this film, perhaps not being constructed the best, or, like all these nitpicks that I have about the dialogue, it's quite satisfying, actually, these final arcs and these final moments in these arcs, because it feels like you have been taken on a journey, and it feels complete in that way. So then they have the fight, and then, Arthur doesn't want to kill Orm, and Atlanta shows up, and it's funny because the sun just kind of shows up, and as soon as Atlanta walks onto the ship, which it's so cheesy, but you know what, it's fine, because it's the way that the film wanted to be, and I don't have any complaints about that. So, and yeah, the film ends. How else do you think it ends? It ends with Jason Momoa saying, "I am Aquaman," which, okay, great. And the ending song, by the way, "Everything I Need," I think, or something like that, is a great song. I think I don't usually talk about these kinds of songs if there are pop songs that were specifically written for these films, but it's a great song. Something that one that I listened to a little bit after the film came out. And you have this final credit scene with Black Manta and Randall Park, and that is Aquaman. And so I will say, as we wrap up the film here, and I do think that one of the things that stands out to me about this film is that when it's done, it feels complete. And that's not something you can say about a lot of films that take swings like this, visually, or even swings in the sense of just not taking itself seriously. This film took some swings. Like it was very assured in what it wanted to do. It set up a lot of things at the beginning, but it paid them all off, right? And yeah, I mean, did it rely on sort of odd transitions to kind of speed up the story? And did it rely on poor dialogue and over-the-top acting? Yeah, sure. But I was really struck by the fact that by the end of the film, you got what you came for, right? And everything that happened in the film felt very complete. And so in that way, I think the first time, now transitioning into the last part of this podcast where I talk about how my thoughts might have changed and what my new thoughts are about this film, I think the first time, I was just entertained. It was just an entertaining film, especially in the theaters, to watch the trench scene and all the water fighting. And I probably was cringing a little bit at certain parts of the film. But this time, I think it was just able to take a step back and say that, yeah, I mean, this is a film that knew exactly what it wanted to be, was set up in such a way that it was able to succeed. You might argue that, okay, sure, you set such a low bar for yourself that you were able to clear it. Good job. But I think that there is a place for films like this that are not going for Oscars in dialogue, or not going for Oscars in anything perhaps but visual effects. And yet they work. Like they rely on tropes, but they tell a story that is just satisfying. This isn't the greatest comic book movie of all time, in my opinion. Not even close. But it's a film that, if it were to come on, if my friends or family wanted to watch it, I would totally not be opposed to watching it, because I think that there's something there with the entertainment value of a film like this that I really enjoyed. So, yeah, those are my updated thoughts on Aquaman. Guys, thank you so much for sticking with me here in these podcasts. I know that I've been tending to go a little bit longer in the recent episodes with these DCE Rewatch podcast episodes. And I appreciate those of you who have been sticking around to listen to my thoughts on all of these different films. And I think a part of it is just because I really, once I start taking notes here, I really get into it. And I really have a lot of things I want to say because I'm enjoying this. I'm really enjoying whether or not I like the films or not. And I haven't liked all of these films, all 6 of them, but I have liked a few of them. It's been, I think, just really fun to talk about and to kind of dissect what I think about these movies. And so it's been a real joy. So next time up in the DCEU rewatch series, we will be doing Shazam, first Shazam movie, a film that I have some fondness for. One of the first DCEU films that I really felt connected with me and I enjoyed. And so I'll be curious because it's been a while since I've seen that first film, and I'll be very curious to see what I think about it then. So in the meantime, guys, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel. Leave a comment down below. If you're on Spotify, give this podcast a rating. If you could, that would be greatly appreciated. And I will see you guys in the next one.